Hey guys, tonight we journey into one of the most brutal and terrifying experiences of the medieval world, the castle siege. Those massive stone fortresses that dot the European landscape weren't just architectural marvels or romantic backdrops for fairy tales. They were survival machines designed to withstand months of relentless assault, and the people trapped inside them faced horrors that would break even the strongest among us. Starvation, disease, psychological warfare, and the constant threat of violent death were just the beginning. Before we settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if this kind of storytelling truly resonates with you. And in the comments, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is right now. It's always heartwarming to see how these quiet stories reach people from every corner of the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this. You're standing on the battlements of a medieval castle, looking out over the surrounding countryside. It's a beautiful spring morning in the year 1216. The sun is rising over the rolling hills, birds are singing, and for a moment, everything seems peaceful. Then you see it, a dark line on the horizon, growing larger by the minute. An army, thousands of soldiers marching toward your castle, their armor glinting in the morning light, their banners snapping in the breeze. Your stomach drops. You know what's coming. This isn't going to be a quick battle that's over in an afternoon. This is going to be a siege, a brutal war of attrition that could last for weeks, months, or even years. And you're trapped inside these walls with hundreds of other people, all of you dependent on the food stores in the cellars, the water in the wells, and the strength of the stone that surrounds you. The romantic image of castle life that we've absorbed from movies and television is about to be shattered like glass. There will be no heroic last stands, no dramatic sword fights on the ramparts, no noble knights riding to the rescue at the last moment. Instead, there will be slow starvation, creeping disease, psychological torture, and the grinding realization that you're probably going to die here, behind these walls that were supposed to protect you. Tonight, we're going to explore what it was really like to endure a medieval castle siege. We'll discover why your chances of survival were shockingly low, even if you were inside the supposedly impregnable fortress. We'll learn about the weapons that could tear through stone walls, the diseases that spread through crowded castle halls, and the psychological horrors that drove defenders to madness or betrayal. We'll walk through every stage of a siege, from the first terrifying moments when you realize you're surrounded, through the long months of deprivation and fear, to the final desperate hours when the walls are breached and the enemy pours through. We'll meet the people who lived through these ordeals, the lords and ladies, the soldiers and servants, the children and elderly who found themselves trapped in a nightmare from which there was no escape. Because the truth is, medieval castle sieges were some of the most horrific military operations in human history. They combined the worst aspects of warfare, violence, destruction, and death with the worst aspects of imprisonment, confinement, deprivation, and helplessness. They could drag on for so long that entire generations grew up knowing nothing but life under siege. They could be so brutal that survivors were left traumatized for the rest of their lives. And they were far more common than most people realize. During the medieval period, castle sieges were a regular feature of warfare. Kings besieged rebellious barons, rival nobles besieged each other, and invading armies besieged border fortresses. Some castles were besieged multiple times over their history, their walls bearing the scars of repeated assaults. The castle itself, that symbol of medieval power and security, was both your greatest protection and your worst prison. Its thick walls kept the enemy out, but they also kept you in. Its deep wells provided water, but they could run dry or become contaminated. Its storerooms held food, but never enough to last indefinitely. The castle was designed to help you survive a siege, but it couldn't guarantee your survival. Nothing could. So let's begin our journey into this medieval nightmare. Let's discover why you, despite all the advantages of modern knowledge and perspective, would almost certainly not survive a medieval castle siege. because understanding the brutal reality of these events helps us appreciate not just the ingenuity of medieval military engineering, but also the incredible suffering that ordinary people endured in an age when violence was the primary means of settling disputes and human life was considered cheap and expendable. The siege is about to begin. The enemy is at the gates, and your chances of seeing another spring are fading with every passing moment. The first sign that your world was about to end wouldn't be dramatic or sudden. It would be subtle. A messenger arriving at the castle gates with news of an army on the march, a scout reporting unusual troop movements in the neighboring territory, or perhaps just a growing sense of unease as political tensions escalated between your lord and his rivals. In the medieval world, sieges didn't happen without warning. They were the culmination of disputes that had been brewing for months or even years. But knowing that a siege was coming didn't make it any less terrifying. In fact, the anticipation might have been worse than the actual event, because you had time to imagine all the horrors that awaited you. You had time to calculate how much food was in the storerooms, how many soldiers were available to defend the walls, and how long you might be able to hold out against a determined enemy. And those calculations rarely offered much comfort. The moment your lord decided to prepare for a siege, life inside the castle would change dramatically. Every able-bodied person would be pressed into service, regardless of their normal duties or social status. Servants who usually worked in the kitchens would find themselves hauling stones to the battlements. Craftsmen who made shoes or barrels would be assigned to repair weapons and armor. Even children would be given tasks appropriate to their age and strength, carrying water, tending the wounded, or running messages between different parts of the castle. The first priority was always food. The castle's steward would conduct a thorough inventory of everything edible in the storerooms, cellars, and surrounding lands. Grain, salted meat, dried fish, cheese, vegetables, fruits, wine, ale, everything would be counted, catalogued, and rationed. The steward would calculate how long these supplies could feed the castle's population at various levels of consumption, and those calculations would determine the castle's strategy for the coming siege. But gathering food wasn't as simple as just stockpiling what you already had. If there was time before the enemy arrived, the castle's garrison would venture out into the surrounding countryside to collect additional supplies. This was called a scorched earth policy, and it was as brutal as it sounds. Soldiers would sweep through nearby villages and farms, confiscating every scrap of food they could find. Grain stores would be emptied. Livestock would be driven back to the castle, and anything that couldn't be moved would be destroyed to prevent it from falling into enemy hands. The peasants who lived in these villages had no say in the matter. Their lord had the legal right to take whatever he needed for the defense of his castle, and they were expected to comply without complaint. Many families would be left with nothing: no food for the winter, no seed for spring planting, no animals to provide milk or eggs. Some would be invited to take shelter inside the castle, but most would be turned away because there simply wasn't room or resources to support them. These unfortunate souls would be left to fend for themselves, caught between the castle they couldn't enter and the enemy army that was approaching. Water was the next critical concern. A castle without a reliable water source was essentially indefensible, because no amount of food would matter if everyone died of thirst within a few days. Most castles were built with this in mind, featuring deep wells that reached down to underground aquifers or springs. Some castles even had multiple wells as a backup, in case one failed or became contaminated. Testing the wells before a siege was crucial. The water would be drawn up and examined for clarity, taste, and smell. If it seemed questionable, it might be boiled or filtered through cloth to remove impurities. The well itself would be inspected to ensure that the walls were sound and that there was no risk of collapse. Guards would be posted to prevent sabotage. One of the most effective ways to break a siege was to poison the defender's water supply, and everyone knew it. Weapons and ammunition had to be prepared in vast quantities. Arrows by the thousands, crossbow bolts by the hundreds, stones for throwing from the walls, boiling oil or water, quicklime to blind attackers, and any other projectile that could be hurled at the enemy. Blacksmiths would work around the clock, repairing damaged weapons and creating new ones. Carpenters would build or repair siege engines that could be used to defend the walls, catapults, ballistae, and other mechanical weapons that could strike at the enemy from a distance. The psychological preparation was perhaps the most important and most difficult aspect of preparing for a siege. The castle's lord would gather everyone together, soldiers, servants, family members, and any refugees who had been granted shelter, and deliver a speech designed to boost morale and strengthen resolve. He would remind them of their duty, their honor, and the righteousness of their cause. He would promise that relief was coming, that the enemy would eventually give up, that they would survive if they just held on. But everyone knew that these promises might be empty. Relief armies often failed to arrive, either because they were defeated in battle or because the political situation changed and support evaporated. Enemies didn't always give up. Some were willing to maintain a siege for years if necessary, and survival was never guaranteed, no matter how strong the walls or how brave the defenders. The waiting was agonizing. Days would pass, then weeks, as the enemy army drew closer. Scouts would bring regular updates on their progress. They've crossed the river. They've reached the forest. They've made camp 10 miles away, 5 miles, 2 miles. Each report would tighten the knot of fear in your stomach. Sleep would become difficult. Appetites would fade. Tempers would fray as the stress mounted. Children would sense the tension and become frightened or clingy. The elderly would remember previous sieges they had endured and share stories that were meant to be encouraging but often had the opposite effect. Young soldiers who had never experienced combat would try to hide their fear behind bravado, while veterans would grow quiet and withdrawn, knowing what was coming. Religious observances would intensify. Priests would lead prayers for deliverance, and people would make offerings to their favorite saints. Some would confess sins they had been hiding for years, wanting to make peace with God before the violence began. Others would seek out relics or holy objects that were believed to have protective powers. The chapel would be constantly occupied by people seeking comfort or courage through prayer. Then, finally, the enemy would arrive. You would see them from the battlements, a vast host spreading across the landscape like a dark stain. Tents would spring up, forming a siege camp that surrounded the castle on all sides. Banners would be raised, identifying the various lords and knights who had joined the attacking force. Siege engines would be assembled, massive wooden structures that looked like instruments of torture, which in a sense they were. The enemy commander would send a herald to the castle gates with terms for surrender. These terms varied depending on the situation, but they usually offered some form of mercy if the castle yielded immediately. The defenders might be allowed to leave with their lives and personal possessions. The lord might be taken prisoner but treated with respect according to the customs of chivalry. Ordinary soldiers and servants might be released unharmed, but everyone knew that these terms would become harsher the longer the siege lasted. If the castle held out for weeks or months, forcing the attackers to expend resources and lose men, the eventual terms of surrender would be much more severe. The defenders might be executed, enslaved, or subjected to brutal reprisals. The castle itself might be destroyed to prevent it from being used again. The decision of whether to surrender or resist was ultimately the lord's to make, but it affected everyone inside the castle. Some lords were willing to negotiate and accept reasonable terms, especially if they believed their position was hopeless. Others were too proud or too stubborn to yield, even when resistance meant condemning everyone in the castle to suffering and possible death. And some had no choice. They were rebels or traitors whose surrender would mean execution regardless of when it occurred, so they had nothing to lose by fighting to the bitter end. Once the decision was made to resist, there was no turning back. The herald would be sent away with a defiant message, and the siege would begin in earnest. The gates would be sealed, the drawbridge raised, and the portcullis lowered. Guards would take their positions on the walls, watching the enemy camp for any sign of movement. Everyone else would retreat to their assigned stations inside the castle, waiting for the first attack. The psychological impact of this moment cannot be overstated. You were now trapped. The outside world was cut off, and you were entirely dependent on the resources within the castle walls. Your fate was no longer in your own hands, but in the hands of your lord, the strength of the fortifications, and the determination of the enemy. The siege had begun, and there was no way to know how or when it would end. The first night of a siege was always the worst. The darkness seemed to press in from all sides, and every sound from outside the walls, a shout, A clang of metal, the creak of a siege engine, would send a jolt of fear through your body. Sleep was impossible for most people. They would lie awake, listening, imagining, dreading what the morning would bring. And when morning came, the real nightmare would begin. The medieval siege was not a simple matter of soldiers attacking walls with ladders and battering rams, though those certainly played a role. It was a sophisticated military operation that employed an arsenal of specialized weapons designed to break through stone fortifications that could be 20 feet thick or more. These weapons were marvels of medieval engineering, but they were also instruments of terror that could reduce the strongest castle to rubble and the bravest defenders to quivering wrecks. The trebuchet was the king of siege weapons, a massive counterweight-powered catapult that could hurl stones weighing 300 pounds or more over distances of 300 yards. The largest trebuchets, like the one King Edward III of England built for the siege of Stirling Castle in 1304, were so enormous that they required dozens of men weeks to construct and could throw projectiles weighing as much as 300 pounds. The psychological impact of a trebuchet was almost as devastating as its physical destructive power. Imagine standing on the castle walls and watching as the enemy's engineers adjusted their massive machine, calculating angles and distances. You would see the counterweight being raised, hear the creaking of timber and rope, and then watch in horror as a boulder the size of a small cart was loaded into the sling. The moment of release was terrifying. A sudden violent motion accompanied by a sound like thunder, and then the projectile would arc through the air, seeming to move in slow motion as it approached the castle. The impact was catastrophic. A 300-pound stone hitting a wall at high velocity could shatter masonry, create cracks that would spread through the structure, and send deadly fragments flying in all directions. Defenders on the walls would be killed or maimed by flying debris. The constant bombardment would gradually weaken the fortifications, creating breaches that the enemy could exploit. The medieval siege was not a simple matter of soldiers attacking walls with ladders and battering rams, though those certainly played a role. It was a sophisticated military operation that employed an arsenal of specialized weapons designed to break through stone fortifications that could be 20 feet thick or more. These weapons were marvels of medieval engineering, but they were also instruments of terror that could reduce the strongest castle to rubble and the bravest defenders to quivering wrecks. The trebuchet was the king of siege weapons, a massive counterweight-powered catapult that could hurl stones weighing 300 pounds or more over distances of 300 yards. The largest trebuchets, like the one King Edward I of England built for the siege of Stirling Castle in 1304, were so enormous that they required dozens of men weeks to construct and could throw projectiles weighing as much as 300 pounds. The psychological impact of a trebuchet was almost as devastating as its physical destructive power. Imagine standing on the castle walls and watching as the enemy's engineers adjusted their massive machine, calculating angles and distances. You would see the counterweight being raised, hear the creaking of timber and rope, and then watch in horror as a boulder the size of a small cart was loaded into the sling. The moment of release was terrifying. A sudden violent motion accompanied by a sound like thunder, and then the projectile would arc through the air, seeming to move in slow motion as it approached the castle. The impact was catastrophic. A 300-pound stone hitting a wall at high velocity could shatter masonry, create cracks that would spread through the structure, and send deadly fragments flying in all directions. Defenders on the walls would be killed or maimed by flying debris. The constant bombardment would gradually weaken the fortifications, creating breaches that the enemy could exploit. But stones weren't the only projectiles that trebuchets could throw. Medieval commanders were creative and ruthless in their choice of ammunition. Dead animals, particularly horses, would be hurled over the walls to spread disease and demoralize the defenders. The rotting carcasses would contaminate water supplies and create unbearable stenches that made life inside the castle even more miserable. Even more horrifying was the practice of throwing the severed heads of captured defenders back into the castle. This psychological warfare tactic was designed to break the morale of those inside, showing them the fate that awaited them if they were captured. Sometimes entire bodies would be thrown, or prisoners who were still alive, screaming as they sailed through the air before crashing into the castle courtyard. Fire was another weapon in the trebuchet's arsenal. Clay pots filled with burning pitch, oil, or other incendiary materials would be launched over the walls, starting fires that could spread rapidly through the wooden structures inside the castle. Even stone buildings weren't safe. The intense heat could crack stone and cause roofs to collapse. Fighting fires during a siege was extremely difficult because water was precious and needed for drinking, and the constant threat of attack made it dangerous to organize firefighting efforts. The mangonel was a smaller, torsion-powered catapult that was less powerful than the trebuchet, but more mobile and easier to construct. Mangonels could be built quickly from local materials and positioned closer to the castle walls, where they could target specific weak points with greater accuracy. They were particularly effective at destroying wooden structures like hoardings, temporary wooden galleries that defenders built on top of the walls to provide better firing positions. Ballistae were essentially giant crossbows mounted on wheeled frames. They fired massive bolts or spears that could pierce through wooden shields and even some types of armor. While they couldn't damage stone walls directly, they were deadly anti-personnel weapons that could kill defenders on the battlements from a safe distance. A ballista bolt could skewer multiple men if they were standing in line, and the psychological effect of watching your comrades being impaled by these massive projectiles was devastating. The battering ram was one of the oldest and most straightforward siege weapons, but it was also one of the most effective. A massive tree trunk, often with an iron or bronze head shaped like a ram's head, would be suspended from a wooden frame by chains or ropes. Teams of men would swing it back and forth, building momentum until it crashed into the castle gate or wall with tremendous force. The sound of a battering ram at work was relentless and terrifying, a rhythmic booming that echoed through the castle and seemed to shake the very foundations. Boom, boom, boom. Each impact would send vibrations through the stone, and defenders could feel the walls shuddering beneath their feet. The psychological effect was profound. It felt like the castle itself was being beaten to death, and there was nothing you could do to stop it. Defenders would try to counter battering rams in various ways. They would drop heavy stones or burning materials on the ram and its operators. They would try to hook the ram with chains and pull it aside or upward, throwing off its rhythm. They would pour boiling oil or water through murder holes onto the men operating the ram. But these countermeasures were dangerous and often ineffective, especially if the ram was protected by a siege tower or a covered shed called a cat or tortoise. Siege towers were mobile fortifications that allowed attackers to approach the castle walls while protected from defensive fire. These massive wooden structures, sometimes as tall as the castle walls themselves, would be built in the siege camp and then slowly wheeled toward the fortifications. The largest siege towers had multiple levels, with archers and crossbowmen on the lower floors providing covering fire, while assault troops gathered on the top level, ready to storm the walls when the tower was positioned against them. The approach of a siege tower was a moment of extreme danger for defenders. As the tower drew closer, the attackers inside would be protected from most defensive fire, while they could shoot at the defenders with relative impunity. When the tower finally reached the wall, a drawbridge would drop from its top level onto the battlements, and enemy soldiers would pour across, fighting hand-to-hand with the defenders in a desperate struggle for control of the walls. Defenders would try to destroy siege towers before they reached the walls, using fire arrows, catapults, or any other means at their disposal. The towers were made of wood and were vulnerable to fire, but they were often covered with wet hides or metal plates to provide some protection. If a siege tower did catch fire, it would become a death trap for the men inside, who would be burned alive or forced to jump from great heights to escape the flames. Mining was perhaps the most insidious form of siege warfare. Sappers, specialized soldiers who were experts in digging and engineering, would tunnel under the castle walls, creating chambers that were supported by wooden props. Once the tunnel reached the desired location, the chamber would be filled with combustible materials like pig fat and then set on fire. As the wooden supports burned away, the tunnel would collapse, and the wall above it would come crashing down, creating a breach that assault troops could exploit. The defenders' only defense against mining was countermining, digging their own tunnels to intercept the enemy's tunnels and either collapse them or fight the sappers underground in brutal hand-to-hand combat. These underground battles were fought in near-total darkness, in cramped spaces where there was barely room to swing a weapon, with the constant fear that the tunnel might collapse and bury everyone alive. Defenders would also try to detect mining operations by placing bowls of water on the ground and watching for ripples that might indicate digging beneath the castle. They would listen for the sounds of picks and shovels working underground, but these methods were unreliable, and often the first sign of a mine was when the wall suddenly collapsed without warning. The crossbow was the sniper rifle of medieval warfare, capable of penetrating armor at ranges of up to 200 yards. Crossbowmen on both sides would engage in deadly duels, trying to pick off enemy soldiers who exposed themselves on the walls or in the siege camp. The psychological pressure of knowing that a crossbow bolt could strike you at any moment, even when you thought you were safe, was immense. Arrows from longbows were less powerful than crossbow bolts but could be fired much more rapidly, creating a rain of projectiles that made it dangerous to move around on the walls. English longbowmen were particularly feared for their ability to maintain a high rate of fire for extended periods, and their arrows could still kill or wound at ranges of up to 300 yards. Greek fire was a terrifying incendiary weapon that was used primarily in the Byzantine Empire but occasionally appeared in Western European sieges. This mysterious substance, whose exact composition remains unknown to this day, would ignite on contact with water and burn with an intense heat that was almost impossible to extinguish. It could be thrown in pots, sprayed from tubes, or launched from catapults, and it struck terror into the hearts of those who faced it. Defenders had their own arsenal of weapons to use against attackers. Boiling oil was expensive and rarely used, but boiling water was just as effective at scalding attackers who were trying to climb ladders or operate battering rams. Quicklime, when thrown on attackers, would react with moisture in their eyes and on their skin, causing excruciating burns and temporary or permanent blindness. Stones were the most common defensive projectile, cheap, plentiful, and devastatingly effective when dropped from a height. A stone weighing just 10 pounds, when dropped from a wall 60 feet high, would hit with enough force to crush a skull or break bones even through armor. Defenders would stockpile thousands of stones on the battlements, ready to rain down on anyone who approached the walls. Pitch and tar could be heated and poured on attackers, sticking to their skin and armor and causing horrible burns. Sand could be heated until it was red hot and then poured on attackers, where it would work its way into gaps in armor and cause agonizing injuries. Beehives could be thrown down on attackers, releasing swarms of angry bees that would sting anyone in the vicinity. The defenders' most powerful psychological weapon was their determination and ingenuity. They would devise creative ways to counter each new threat, adapting their tactics as the siege progressed. They would taunt the attackers, showing them that their efforts were futile and that the castle would never fall. They would display food on the walls to show that they had plenty of supplies, even if they were actually starving. They would make noise at night to prevent the attackers from sleeping, or maintain eerie silence to unnerve them. But all of these weapons and tactics came with a terrible cost. The constant bombardment, the threat of fire, the fear of walls collapsing, and the knowledge that death could come at any moment from any direction created a state of perpetual terror that wore down even the strongest defenders. The physical destruction was matched by psychological destruction, and often it was the latter that determined the outcome of a siege. The weapons of medieval siege warfare were designed not just to break stone walls, but to break human spirits, and they were terrifyingly effective at both. Of all the horrors of a medieval castle siege, starvation was perhaps the most insidious and inevitable. No matter how strong your walls, how brave your soldiers, or how skilled your commanders, if the siege lasted long enough, hunger would eventually defeat you. And the process of starving to death was slow, agonizing, and degrading in ways that stripped away your humanity piece by piece. The first few weeks of a siege were usually manageable from a food perspective. The castle's storerooms would be full of supplies that had been gathered in preparation for the siege, and rationing would ensure that everyone received at least some food each day. The meals would be simple and monotonous: bread, dried meat, cheese, perhaps some vegetables or legumes, but they would be sufficient to maintain strength and morale. But as the weeks turned into months, the situation would deteriorate rapidly. The bread would become harder and more stale as the grain supplies dwindled. The meat would become more rancid, as the salt used to preserve it lost its effectiveness. The cheese would develop mold that had to be cut away, and eventually, there would be more mold than cheese. The vegetables would rot or be consumed, leaving nothing but the least appetizing preserved foods. Rationing would become increasingly severe. What had started as reduced portions would become tiny scraps that left everyone constantly hungry. The castle's steward would carefully measure out each person's allotment, and guards would be posted to prevent theft from the storerooms. But theft would happen anyway because hunger makes people desperate and willing to take risks they would never normally consider. The social hierarchy of the castle would be reflected in the distribution of food. The lord and his family would continue to eat relatively well because maintaining their strength and morale was considered essential to the defense. Knights and soldiers would receive larger rations than servants and common people because they needed to be able to fight. The elderly, the sick, and children would receive the smallest portions because they were considered less essential to the castle's survival. This inequality would breed resentment and conflict. Servants would watch bitterly as the lord's family ate meat while they subsisted on moldy bread. Common soldiers would resent the knights who received better food despite doing no more work. Families would fight over how to divide their meager rations among their members. The social bonds that held the castle community together would begin to fray under the pressure of hunger. As the food supplies dwindled further, people would begin eating things that would normally be considered inedible. Leather belts, shoes, and saddles would be boiled to extract whatever nutrition they might contain. The resulting broth would be thin and tasteless, but it would at least provide something to fill empty stomachs. Rats, mice, and other vermin that infested the castle would be hunted and eaten. Dogs and cats that had been kept as pets would disappear into cooking pots. The horses were a particularly difficult decision. These valuable animals were essential for warfare and transportation, and they represented a significant investment. But they were also large sources of meat that could feed many people for days. The decision of when to slaughter the horses was agonizing. Do it too early, and you lose military capability that might be needed. Do it too late, and the horses might die of starvation anyway, their meat wasted. When the horses were finally slaughtered, every part of the animal would be used. The meat would be carefully rationed and preserved as best as possible. The bones would be boiled repeatedly to extract every bit of nutrition. The hide would be eaten after being boiled until it was soft enough to chew. Even the hooves would be boiled to make a gelatinous substance that could be eaten. The physical effects of starvation would become increasingly apparent as the siege dragged on. People would lose weight rapidly, their bodies consuming muscle and fat to stay alive. Faces would become gaunt and hollow, with prominent cheekbones and sunken eyes. Skin would become loose and papery, hanging from bones that were increasingly visible. Hair would become brittle and fall out. Teeth would loosen in their sockets. The psychological effects were equally devastating. Hunger dominated every thought, making it difficult to concentrate on anything else. People would become obsessed with food, talking about it constantly, dreaming about it, hallucinating about it. They would remember meals they had eaten in the past with an intensity that was almost painful. They would plan elaborate feasts they would have when the siege ended if they survived. Personality changes were common. People who had been kind and generous would become selfish and aggressive, hoarding any scrap of food they could find. Those who had been brave would become cowardly, willing to betray their comrades for a crust of bread. Family bonds would be tested as parents struggled with the impossible decision of whether to give their own meager rations to their children or keep them to maintain their own strength. Children suffered particularly terribly during sieges. Their growing bodies needed more nutrition than adults, but they received less because they were considered less important to the defense. They would cry constantly from hunger, a sound that tormented their parents and everyone else in the castle. Many children would die of starvation before the siege ended, their small bodies unable to survive on the minimal rations they received. The elderly were also vulnerable. Their bodies were less able to cope with malnutrition, and they would often die relatively early in a siege. Some elderly people would voluntarily reduce their own rations to give more food to younger family members, essentially choosing to starve to death so that others might live. This self-sacrifice was both noble and heartbreaking, and it added to the psychological burden of those who survived. Disease became more common as malnutrition weakened everyone's immune systems. Scurvy would develop from lack of vitamin C, causing gums to bleed, teeth to fall out, and old wounds to reopen. Beriberi from lack of vitamin B would cause weakness, confusion, and heart problems. Pellagra from lack of niacin would cause skin lesions, diarrhea, and dementia. These deficiency diseases would kill people even if they weren't technically starving to death. The social order would begin to break down as hunger became more severe. Theft of food would become common despite harsh punishments. People would fight over scraps, sometimes killing each other over a piece of moldy bread. Guards posted to protect the storerooms might be bribed or might simply steal food for themselves. The Lord's authority would be challenged as desperate people demanded more food or better distribution. Cannibalism was the ultimate taboo, but it did occur during the most desperate sieges. Historical records document cases where defenders resorted to eating the bodies of those who had died, and in the most extreme cases, to killing the weak or sick to provide food for the stronger. These acts were considered horrific even by medieval standards, and those who engaged in them were often executed if the siege ended and their crimes were discovered. The decision of when to surrender was often driven by starvation rather than military defeat. A castle might have strong walls and plenty of ammunition, but if the defenders were too weak from hunger to fight, the fortifications were useless. Lords would sometimes hold out until the last possible moment, hoping for relief that never came, condemning everyone in the castle to unnecessary suffering and death. The psychological trauma of starvation lasted long after the siege ended. Survivors would be haunted by memories of the hunger, the desperation, and the things they had done or seen others do to survive. They would hoard food compulsively, unable to feel secure even when supplies were plentiful. They would have nightmares about starving again. Some would never fully recover psychologically from the experience. The physical recovery from severe starvation was also difficult and dangerous. When food finally became available again, people who had been starving couldn't simply start eating normally. Their digestive systems had shut down, and eating too much too quickly could cause refeeding syndrome, a potentially fatal condition where the body's chemistry becomes dangerously imbalanced. Many siege survivors died in the days and weeks after the siege ended, killed by the very food they had been craving. The moral questions raised by starvation during sieges were profound and troubling. Was it right for the Lord to eat better than his servants? Should parents give their food to their children, even if it meant they would die? Was it acceptable to eat animals that had been pets? What about eating the dead? These questions had no easy answers, and different people made different choices based on their own values and circumstances. The strategic use of starvation by besieging armies was deliberate and calculated. Commanders knew that hunger was one of their most effective weapons, and they would do everything possible to prevent food from reaching the castle. They would destroy crops in the surrounding countryside, kill livestock, and blockade roads and rivers to cut off supply lines. They would sometimes allow refugees to leave the castle, knowing that this would deplete the defenders' food supplies more quickly. In some cases, besieging armies would deliberately prolong sieges to maximize the suffering of the defenders. They would reject offers of surrender, demanding unconditional capitulation only after the defenders had been reduced to the brink of death by starvation. This cruelty served both practical and psychological purposes. It weakened the defenders militarily and sent a message to other potential enemies about the cost of resistance. The impact of starvation on military effectiveness was profound. Soldiers who were weak from hunger couldn't fight effectively. They couldn't wear heavy armor, couldn't draw bowstrings, couldn't swing swords with force. They would become slow and clumsy, easy targets for enemy weapons. Their judgment would be impaired, making them more likely to make mistakes. Their morale would collapse as they realized that they were going to die slowly of hunger rather than quickly in battle. The economic cost of sieges was also related to starvation. The food that was consumed during a siege represented a significant investment that was lost forever. The livestock that was slaughtered couldn't be used for breeding or labor. The grain that was eaten couldn't be planted for next year's crop. Even if the castle survived the siege, the economic damage could take years to recover from. The religious dimension of starvation during sieges was complex. Some people saw their suffering as a test from God, an opportunity to demonstrate faith and endurance. Others saw it as punishment for sins, either their own or their Lord's. Priests would lead prayers for deliverance and would try to provide spiritual comfort to those who were suffering. But religion could only do so much to ease the physical agony of starvation. The historical legacy of starvation during medieval sieges influenced military strategy for centuries. Commanders learned that sieges were often won or lost based on logistics rather than combat. The side that could maintain its supply lines and keep its troops fed would usually prevail, regardless of the strength of fortifications or the bravery of defenders. This lesson would shape warfare well into the modern era. If you had been trapped in a castle during a medieval siege, starvation would have been your constant companion and your most likely cause of death. The slow deterioration of your body, the obsessive focus on food, the moral compromises you would be forced to make, and the knowledge that you were slowly dying would have been almost unbearable. And even if you survived, you would carry the scars of that experience for the rest of your life. While starvation was a slow and agonizing way to die during a medieval castle siege, disease could kill you even faster and more horribly. The conditions inside a besieged castle were perfect for the spread of infectious diseases. Crowded living quarters, poor sanitation, contaminated water, weakened immune systems from malnutrition, and no way to escape or seek medical help. What started as a few cases of illness could rapidly become an epidemic that killed more people than enemy weapons ever could. The most feared disease during medieval sieges was the plague, particularly the bubonic plague that would later become known as the Black Death. This bacterial infection, spread by fleas that lived on rats, could kill up to 60% of those infected within days of the first symptoms appearing. The disease would begin with fever, chills, and weakness, followed by the appearance of painful swellings called buboes in the lymph nodes of the groin, armpits, and neck. These buboes would grow to the size of eggs or apples, turning black and oozing pus and blood. The progression of plague was terrifying to witness. Victims would develop dark patches on their skin as blood vessels burst beneath the surface, giving the disease its name, the Black Death. They would cough up blood, vomit uncontrollably, and suffer from delirium and hallucinations. The smell of death would hang over them even before they died, a sickly sweet odor that everyone in the castle would come to recognize and dread. In the confined space of a besieged castle, plague could spread with devastating speed. The rats that carried the infected fleas thrived in the unsanitary conditions, multiplying rapidly and spreading throughout the castle. People living in close quarters would pass the disease to each other through flea bites, and in some cases through respiratory droplets if the infection spread to the lungs, creating the even more deadly pneumonic plague. There was no effective treatment for plague in the medieval period. Physicians would try bloodletting, purging, and various herbal remedies, but these treatments were useless and often made patients worse. Some people believed that the disease was caused by bad air or divine punishment, leading to treatments that ranged from burning aromatic herbs to public flagellation and prayer. The only real defense was isolation. But in a crowded castle under siege, isolation was impossible. The psychological impact of a plague outbreak during a siege was catastrophic. People would watch their friends and family members die horrible deaths, knowing that they might be next. The fear of infection would make people avoid each other, breaking down the social bonds that were essential for maintaining morale and cooperation. Some people would become fatalistic, believing that death was inevitable and giving up on defending the castle. Others would become hysterical, engaging in desperate and irrational behaviors in an attempt to ward off the disease. Dysentery was another common killer during sieges. This intestinal infection, caused by bacteria or parasites in contaminated food or water, would cause severe diarrhea, abdominal cramps, fever, and dehydration. In the medieval period, dysentery was often called the bloody flux because of the blood that appeared in victims' stool. The disease was highly contagious and spread rapidly in unsanitary conditions. The impact of dysentery on a besieged castle was devastating. Victims would become too weak to perform their duties, whether fighting on the walls or working in the kitchens. The constant diarrhea would deplete the body's fluids and electrolytes, leading to dehydration that could be fatal within days. The smell and mess created by dozens or hundreds of people suffering from dysentery would make living conditions even more unbearable. Treating dysentery was difficult with medieval medical knowledge. Physicians might prescribe binding agents to stop the diarrhea, but this could actually make the infection worse by preventing the body from expelling the bacteria or parasites. Keeping patients hydrated was essential, but clean water was often scarce during a siege. Many dysentery victims would die not from the infection itself, but from dehydration and electrolyte imbalances. Typhus was a louse-borne disease that thrived in the crowded, unsanitary conditions of a besieged castle. The disease would begin with fever, headache, and a rash that spread across the body. As it progressed, victims would develop delirium, stupor, and eventually coma. The mortality rate was high, especially among those who were already weakened by malnutrition. The lice that spread typhus were ubiquitous in medieval times. Everyone had them, from the lord to the lowest servant. In normal times, people would try to control lice through bathing and changing clothes, but during a siege, these basic hygiene practices became difficult or impossible. Water was too precious to waste on bathing, and people often wore the same clothes for weeks or months without washing them. The lice would multiply unchecked, spreading from person to person and carrying typhus with them. Typhoid fever, caused by bacteria in contaminated food or water, was another serious threat. The disease would cause high fever, weakness, abdominal pain, and a characteristic rash of flat, rose-colored spots. Victims might become delirious and develop serious complications like intestinal bleeding or perforation. The mortality rate was around 20% even with modern treatment, and much higher in medieval times. The contamination of water supplies was a constant concern during sieges. Wells could become contaminated with human waste, dead animals, or other pollutants. Sometimes the contamination was accidental, but in other cases it was deliberate. Besieging armies would sometimes try to poison the castle's water supply by throwing dead animals or human corpses into the wells. Defenders would try to protect their wells, but it was difficult to prevent all contamination. Scurvy, caused by vitamin C deficiency, would develop after several months without fresh fruits or vegetables. The disease would cause fatigue, weakness, joint pain, and bleeding gums. Teeth would loosen and fall out. Old wounds would reopen. Victims would develop bruises easily and might bleed internally. While scurvy itself was rarely fatal, it would weaken people and make them more vulnerable to other diseases and injuries. The treatment for scurvy was simple: fresh fruits or vegetables containing vitamin C. But these were exactly what was unavailable during a long siege. Some castle defenders might have stored dried fruits or pickled vegetables that retained some vitamin C, but these supplies would be limited and would run out eventually. Sailors on long voyages would later learn to prevent scurvy by bringing citrus fruits, but this knowledge wasn't widely available during the medieval period. Respiratory infections like pneumonia and tuberculosis were common in the cold, damp conditions of castle living. These diseases would spread easily in crowded quarters where people were living in close contact. Pneumonia could kill within days, especially in people who were already weakened by malnutrition. Tuberculosis was a slower killer, causing a chronic cough, weight loss, and eventually death from lung damage. The smoke from cooking fires and torches would irritate people's lungs and make respiratory infections more likely. The poor ventilation in many castle rooms meant that smoke would accumulate, creating a hazy, choking atmosphere that made breathing difficult. People with existing respiratory problems would suffer terribly, and healthy people would develop new problems from the constant exposure to smoke. Wound infections were a major cause of death during sieges. Any injury, no matter how minor, could become infected in the unsanitary conditions of a besieged castle. A simple cut or scrape could develop into a life-threatening infection if bacteria entered the wound. More serious injuries from combat or accidents were even more likely to become infected. Medieval physicians had no understanding of germ theory and no effective antibiotics. They would try to treat infected wounds by cleaning them with wine or vinegar, applying various herbal poultices, and sometimes cauterizing them with hot irons. These treatments were painful and often ineffective. Many people died from infections that would be easily treatable with modern antibiotics. Gangrene was a particularly horrific complication of wound infections. This condition, caused by the death of tissue due to lack of blood flow or bacterial infection, would cause the affected area to turn black, smell terrible, and eventually kill the patient through blood poisoning. The only treatment was amputation, which was a dangerous procedure in itself, and often led to death from shock, blood loss, or infection. Mental illness and psychological breakdown were also forms of disease that affected people during long sieges. The constant stress, fear, and trauma could cause people to develop what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety disorders, and psychosis. Medieval people didn't understand these conditions as medical problems and often attributed them to demonic possession or moral weakness. People suffering from mental illness during a siege might become violent, suicidal, or completely non-functional. They might have hallucinations or delusions that made them dangerous to themselves or others. There was no effective treatment available. Medieval medicine had no concept of psychiatric care. People with severe mental illness might be restrained, isolated, or even killed if they were seen as a threat to the castle's defense. The cumulative effect of multiple diseases spreading simultaneously through a besieged castle was catastrophic. A person weakened by malnutrition would be more susceptible to infectious diseases. Someone suffering from dysentery would be more likely to develop other infections. The various diseases would interact and compound each other, creating a health crisis that could destroy the castle's ability to defend itself. The disposal of the dead became a major problem during disease outbreaks. Bodies would pile up faster than they could be buried, and the lack of space and resources made proper burial difficult or impossible. Bodies might be thrown over the walls, buried in shallow graves within the castle grounds, or simply left to rot in out-of-the-way corners. The decomposing corpses would attract vermin and spread disease even further. The psychological impact of living surrounded by disease and death was profound. People would become numb to suffering, losing their empathy and humanity. They would step over corpses without a second thought. They would abandon sick family members to avoid infection. The normal social bonds and moral constraints that governed behavior would break down under the pressure of survival. Religious responses to disease during sieges were intense and sometimes counterproductive. People would gather for mass prayers and processions, which actually helped spread infectious diseases by bringing people into close contact. They would seek out relics and holy objects that were believed to have healing powers. They would make vows and offerings to saints, but none of these religious practices could stop the spread of disease. Some people would interpret disease outbreaks as divine punishment for sins, leading to scapegoating and violence against those who were blamed for bringing God's wrath upon the castle. Jews, foreigners, or anyone who was different might be accused of poisoning wells or spreading disease deliberately. These accusations could lead to persecution and murder, adding human cruelty to the natural horror of the epidemic. The long-term health effects on siege survivors were severe. Those who survived serious diseases often had permanent damage to their organs, weakened immune systems, and chronic health problems. Survivors of plague might have scarring and tissue damage. Survivors of typhus might have neurological problems. Survivors of dysentery might have chronic digestive issues. The siege would leave physical scars that lasted for the rest of their lives. If you had been trapped in a castle during a medieval siege, disease would have been an ever-present threat that you couldn't escape or fight. You would have watched people around you sicken and die, knowing that you might be next. You would have lived in filth and squalor that made infection almost inevitable. And even if you survived the siege, you would likely carry the physical and psychological scars of disease for the rest of your life. The physical horrors of a medieval castle siege, the starvation, the disease, the violence, were matched and perhaps exceeded by the psychological torment that defenders endured. The human mind was not designed to cope with the prolonged stress, fear, and trauma of siege warfare, and the mental breakdown of defenders was often what ultimately led to a castle's fall. Understanding the psychological dimension of sieges helps us appreciate why survival was so difficult, even for those who were physically strong and well supplied. The initial shock of realizing you were trapped inside a castle under siege would be overwhelming. One day you were going about your normal life, and the next day you were imprisoned behind stone walls with an enemy army surrounding you, intent on your destruction. The sudden loss of freedom and the knowledge that you might never leave the castle alive would trigger intense anxiety and fear that would be difficult to manage. The uncertainty was perhaps the worst aspect of the psychological torture. You had no way of knowing how long the siege would last, days, weeks, months, or years. You didn't know if relief was coming or if you had been abandoned. You didn't know if the walls would hold or if they would be breached. You didn't know if you would die from starvation, disease, enemy weapons, or something else entirely. This constant uncertainty would keep your mind in a state of perpetual stress that was exhausting and demoralizing. The loss of control over your own fate was deeply disturbing. In normal life, you had at least some agency over your circumstances. You could make decisions about where to go, what to do, and how to respond to challenges. But during a siege, all of those choices were taken away. You were completely dependent on your lord's decisions, the strength of the walls, and the actions of the enemy. This helplessness would create feelings of frustration, anger, and despair. The constant threat of death would wear on your psyche in ways that are difficult to imagine. Every moment of every day, you would know that you could be killed at any time. A stone from a trebuchet could crash through the roof and crush you. A fire arrow could start a blaze that would burn you alive. The walls could be breached and enemy soldiers could pour in to slaughter everyone. This awareness of mortality would be exhausting and would make it difficult to focus on anything else. Sleep would become nearly impossible. The noise of siege weapons, the shouts of soldiers, and the general chaos of the siege would continue day and night. Even when things were quiet, your mind would be too active with worry and fear to allow restful sleep. You would lie awake imagining all the terrible things that could happen. When you did manage to sleep, you would have nightmares about death, destruction, and loss. The lack of sleep would compound all the other psychological problems. Sleep deprivation causes irritability, impaired judgment, difficulty concentrating, and increased emotional reactivity. People who are severely sleep deprived can even experience hallucinations and delusions. In a siege situation where clear thinking and emotional stability were essential for survival, sleep deprivation would make everything worse. The monotony and boredom of siege life would be surprisingly difficult to endure. Most of the time during a siege was spent waiting for the next attack, waiting for food rations, waiting for news, waiting for something, anything to happen. This endless waiting with nothing productive to do would be mentally exhausting. Your mind would turn inward, dwelling on fears and worries, creating scenarios and catastrophes that might never happen. The crowding and lack of privacy would create additional psychological stress. You would be living in close quarters, with dozens or hundreds of other people, with no personal space and no opportunity for solitude. You would be constantly surrounded by other people's noise, smells, and emotions. The lack of privacy would make it impossible to process your own feelings or have a moment of peace. Interpersonal conflicts would escalate under the pressure of the siege. Small annoyances that would normally be overlooked would become major sources of friction. People would argue over food, space, duties, and anything else that could be argued about. Friendships would be strained or broken. Families would fight. The social fabric that held the castle community together would begin to tear under the stress. The witnessing of death and suffering would be traumatic in ways that would affect you for the rest of your life. You would see people you knew, friends, family members, neighbors, die horrible deaths from starvation, disease, or violence. You would hear their screams, smell their blood, and be unable to help them. Each death would chip away at your psychological resilience, making it harder to cope with the next one. Children would be particularly vulnerable to psychological trauma during sieges. They would be terrified by the violence and chaos around them, and they would pick up on the fear and stress of the adults. They would have nightmares, become clingy and anxious, or withdraw into themselves. Some children would be so traumatized that they would never fully recover, carrying the psychological scars into adulthood. The elderly would also struggle psychologically. Many had lived through previous sieges or wars and knew exactly what horrors awaited. This knowledge would make their fear more acute because they couldn't comfort themselves with false hope or ignorance. They would also feel guilty about consuming precious resources when they couldn't contribute much to the defense, and some would sink into depression or despair. Guilt was a common psychological burden during sieges. Soldiers would feel guilty about not being able to protect the civilians. Parents would feel guilty about not being able to feed their children adequately. Survivors would feel guilty about outliving those who died. This guilt would be compounded by the moral compromises that people were forced to make: stealing food, abandoning the sick, or doing other things that violated their normal ethical standards. The breakdown of social norms and moral standards would be psychologically disturbing. In normal times, society had rules and expectations about how people should behave. But during a siege, these rules would gradually erode as survival became the only priority. People would do things they never thought they were capable of, and they would witness others doing the same. This moral degradation would be deeply unsettling and would contribute to feelings of shame and self-loathing. Religious faith could be both a source of comfort and a source of additional psychological stress during sieges. Some people would find solace in prayer and in the belief that God was watching over them, but others would struggle with questions about why God was allowing them to suffer. If they believed that the siege was divine punishment for sins, they would feel guilty and fearful about what other punishments might be coming. If they believed that God should protect the righteous, they would feel abandoned and betrayed when suffering continued. The psychological warfare tactics employed by besieging armies were deliberately designed to break the defenders' morale. Attackers would shout insults and threats at the defenders, describing in graphic detail what would happen to them when the castle fell. They would display the heads of captured defenders on pikes. They would make noise at night to prevent sleep. They would spread rumors about relief armies being defeated or about betrayal within the castle. All of these tactics were aimed at creating fear, doubt, and despair. The temptation to surrender or betray the castle would grow stronger as the psychological pressure mounted. People would begin to think that anything, even death or enslavement, would be better than continuing to endure the siege. Some would actively plot to open the gates to the enemy, rationalizing their betrayal as a way to end everyone's suffering. Others would simply give up, becoming passive and non-functional, no longer caring whether they lived or died. The phenomenon of learned helplessness would set in for many defenders. This psychological condition occurs when people are subjected to prolonged stress that they cannot control or escape. They begin to believe that nothing they do matters, that they are powerless to affect their situation. This belief leads to passivity, depression, and a loss of motivation to even try to survive. Learned helplessness could spread through a besieged castle like a contagion, sapping the will to resist. Dissociation was another psychological response to the trauma of siege warfare. People would mentally detach from their experiences, going through the motions of daily life while feeling emotionally numb and disconnected. This dissociation could be protective in the short term, allowing people to function despite overwhelming stress. But it could also be dangerous, making people less alert to threats and less able to respond appropriately to changing circumstances. Some people would develop what we would now recognize as acute stress disorder or post-traumatic stress disorder during the siege. They would have intrusive memories of traumatic events, hypervigilance, exaggerated startle responses, and difficulty controlling their emotions. They might have panic attacks, flashbacks, or dissociative episodes. Medieval people had no understanding of these conditions and no effective treatments for them. The psychological impact of siege warfare on children was particularly severe and long-lasting. Children who survived sieges often grew up with serious psychological problems: anxiety, depression, difficulty forming relationships, and a pervasive sense of insecurity. Some would become violent or antisocial, having learned during the siege that violence was the normal way to resolve conflicts. Others would become overly passive and submissive, having learned that resistance was futile. The collective trauma experienced by everyone in a besieged castle would create a shared psychological burden that affected the entire community. People would feed off each other's fear and despair, creating a downward spiral of morale. Panic could spread rapidly through the castle, triggered by a rumor, a setback, or simply the accumulated stress reaching a breaking point. Once panic set in, it was extremely difficult to restore order and confidence. The psychological recovery from a siege was often incomplete and took years or even decades. Survivors would be haunted by memories of what they had experienced and what they had done to survive. They would have nightmares, flashbacks, and intrusive thoughts. They would be hypervigilant, always watching for threats, unable to relax even in safe situations. Many would develop what we would now call complex PTSD, with symptoms that affected every aspect of their lives. The social stigma attached to siege survivors could compound their psychological problems. People who had been forced to eat rats, leather, or even human flesh to survive would be viewed with disgust and suspicion. Those who had betrayed others or committed other moral transgressions during the siege would be shunned. Even those who had done nothing wrong might be treated differently, as if they were contaminated by their experiences. The inability to talk about their experiences would make psychological recovery even more difficult for siege survivors. Medieval society had no concept of trauma counseling or psychological support. People were expected to simply move on and not dwell on the past. But the traumatic memories couldn't be suppressed or forgotten, and without any outlet for processing them, they would continue to cause psychological distress for years. If you had been trapped in a castle during a medieval siege, the psychological torture would have been as unbearable as the physical hardships. The constant fear, the loss of control, the moral compromises, the witnessing of death and suffering, and the gradual breakdown of your own mental stability would have tested you in ways that you couldn't imagine. And even if your body survived the siege, your mind might not have recovered. After weeks or months of bombardment, starvation, disease, and psychological warfare, the moment that everyone in the castle had been dreading would finally arrive: the final assault. This was when the besieging army would attempt to storm the castle, breaching the walls and engaging in brutal hand-to-hand combat with the defenders. The final assault was the most violent and chaotic phase of a siege, and it was when the highest number of casualties occurred on both sides. The decision to launch a final assault was not made lightly by the attacking commander. Assaults were expensive in terms of lives lost, and there was always a risk that the attack would fail, emboldening the defenders and prolonging the siege. But if the walls had been sufficiently weakened by bombardment, if the defenders were known to be starving and demoralized, or if time was running out for the besieging army, an assault might be the only option. The preparation for an assault would be visible to the defenders, adding to their terror. They would see the enemy troops forming up, siege ladders being brought forward, and assault towers being positioned against the walls. They would hear the enemy commanders shouting orders and the soldiers chanting or singing to build their courage. The defenders would know that within hours they would be fighting for their lives in the most brutal form of combat imaginable. The assault would typically begin at dawn, when the defenders were tired from the night watch and visibility was still limited. The attacking army would advance in waves, with the first wave consisting of expendable troops, often conscripts or mercenaries who were considered less valuable than the professional soldiers who would follow. These first attackers would carry scaling ladders and would attempt to climb the walls while under heavy fire from the defenders. The defenders would rain down everything they had on the attackers: arrows, crossbow bolts, stones, boiling water, quicklime, burning pitch, and anything else that could kill or injure. The noise would be deafening. The screams of wounded men, the clash of weapons, the thud of projectiles hitting shields and armor, the shouts of commanders trying to coordinate the defense. The smell would be overwhelming: blood, smoke, burning flesh, and the acrid stench of fear. Climbing a scaling ladder while under fire was a terrifying experience that required immense courage or desperation. The ladders were tall and unstable, swaying and bouncing with each step. Defenders would try to push the ladders away from the walls using long poles, sending the climbers plummeting to their deaths. They would drop stones on the climbers' heads, crushing skulls even through helmets. They would pour boiling liquids on them, causing horrific burns. The mortality rate among the first wave of attackers was typically very high. If the attackers managed to reach the top of the walls, the fighting would become even more brutal. Combat on the narrow battlements was desperate and chaotic, with no room for sophisticated tactics or formations. It was simply a matter of killing the enemy before they killed you, using whatever weapons were at hand: swords, axes, maces, daggers, or even bare hands. Men would grapple with each other, trying to throw their opponents off the walls to their deaths below. The defenders had some advantages in this close combat. They knew the layout of the walls and could use that knowledge to their advantage. They could retreat to prepared positions and force the attackers to come to them. They could use the narrow staircases and doorways as choke points where a few defenders could hold off many attackers. But these advantages would diminish as more attackers reached the walls and the defenders became exhausted from the constant fighting. If the walls were breached by mining or bombardment, the assault would focus on that breach. The attackers would pour through the gap in the walls, trying to establish a foothold inside the castle before the defenders could seal the breach. The fighting at a breach was particularly intense because both sides knew that control of that point could determine the outcome of the entire siege. Defenders would try to build barricades behind breaches, using whatever materials were available: furniture, stones, timber, even bodies. They would fight desperately to prevent the attackers from expanding their foothold, knowing that if the enemy gained control of a section of wall, they could bring in reinforcements and eventually overwhelm the entire defense. The area around a breach would become a killing ground, with bodies piling up so high that they formed obstacles that both sides had to climb over. Siege towers, when they were used, would create another focal point for intense combat. When a siege tower was positioned against the wall and its drawbridge dropped onto the battlements, enemy soldiers would pour across in a concentrated rush. The defenders would try to prevent the drawbridge from being lowered, or failing that, would try to hold the landing point and prevent the attackers from spreading along the walls. The fighting at a siege tower landing point was some of the most brutal of the entire siege. The psychological impact of the final assault on defenders was devastating. Many would be paralyzed by fear, unable to fight effectively or even to move. Others would fight with desperate courage, knowing that this was their last chance to survive. Some would try to flee, abandoning their posts and seeking hiding places within the castle. The breakdown of discipline and cohesion among the defenders would make the attackers' job easier and would accelerate the castle's fall. Women and children in the castle would be terrified during the final assault, knowing that if the castle fell, they would be at the mercy of the victorious attackers. Some women would take up weapons and fight alongside the men, preferring to die in combat rather than face what might happen if they were captured. Others would hide with their children, praying that they would be overlooked or that the attackers would show mercy. The role of the castle's lord during the final assault was crucial. A brave and inspiring leader could rally the defenders and give them the courage to fight on even when the situation seemed hopeless. But a lord who showed fear or who abandoned his post could cause the defense to collapse entirely. Some lords would fight in the thick of the battle, leading by example. Others would direct the defense from a safer position, trying to coordinate the response to the attack, and some would simply give up, surrendering the castle to save their own lives. The moment when it became clear that the castle was going to fall was one of absolute terror for the defenders. They would see enemy soldiers pouring over the walls or through breaches faster than they could be killed. They would see their comrades falling around them. They would realize that resistance was futile and that they were about to die or be captured. Some would continue fighting to the end, selling their lives dearly. Others would throw down their weapons and beg for mercy. The aftermath of a successful assault was often as horrific as the assault itself. The attacking soldiers, having endured weeks or months of hardship and having lost many comrades in the assault, would be in a state of bloodlust and rage. They would rampage through the castle, killing anyone they encountered, looting everything of value, and destroying what they couldn't carry away. This period of uncontrolled violence, known as sacking, could last for hours or even days. The treatment of prisoners after a castle fell depended on many factors: the customs of warfare at the time, the orders given by the attacking commander, the behavior of the defenders during the siege, and the mood of the victorious soldiers. In some cases, prisoners would be treated relatively well, especially if they were nobles who could be ransomed. In other cases, prisoners would be executed, enslaved, or subjected to torture and abuse. Women and children were particularly vulnerable after a castle fell. Rape was common and was often considered a legitimate reward for victorious soldiers. Women of all ages and social classes could be victims, and there was no effective protection for them. Some women would be taken as slaves or concubines. Others would be killed either during the initial violence or later if they resisted or tried to escape. The destruction of the castle itself was sometimes part of the aftermath of a successful assault. If the attacking lord wanted to ensure that the castle could never be used against him again, he would order it to be slighted, deliberately damaged or destroyed to make it indefensible. Walls would be knocked down, towers would be demolished, and buildings would be burned. This destruction was both practical and symbolic, demonstrating the attacker's power and the futility of resistance. The psychological trauma of surviving a final assault was profound and lasting. Those who lived through it would be haunted by memories of the violence, the screams, the blood, and the faces of those who died. They would have survivor's guilt, wondering why they lived when so many others died. They would have nightmares and flashbacks. Many would never fully recover from the experience. The historical records of medieval sieges are full of accounts of final assaults that were horrifically violent. At the siege of Jerusalem during the First Crusade in 1099, the Crusaders slaughtered tens of thousands of Muslims and Jews after breaching the walls, wading through streets that were said to be ankle-deep in blood. At the siege of Béziers in 1209, the Crusaders killed nearly everyone in the city, including Christians, with the papal legate reportedly saying, "Kill them all, God will know his own." These extreme examples of violence during and after final assaults were not aberrations. They were the norm. Medieval warfare was brutal, and sieges brought out the worst in human nature. The combination of prolonged stress, fear, anger, and the breakdown of normal social constraints created conditions where atrocities were not just possible, but likely. If you had been in a castle during a final assault, your chances of survival would have been very low. If you were a soldier on the walls, you would likely be killed in the fighting. If you were a civilian hiding inside, you might be killed during the sacking or subjected to violence and abuse. Even if you physically survived, the psychological trauma would stay with you for the rest of your life. The final assault was the culmination of all the horrors of the siege, and it was the moment when the castle's fate and yours would be decided in the most violent way possible. When a medieval castle siege finally ended, whether through surrender, successful assault, or relief by a friendly army, the conclusion was rarely the happy ending that modern audiences might expect. The aftermath of a siege was often as traumatic as the siege itself, and the survivors faced challenges that would test them for years to come. Understanding what happened after a siege helps us appreciate the full scope of the suffering that these events caused. If the castle surrendered before being taken by assault, the terms of surrender would determine the fate of everyone inside. In the best-case scenario, the defenders would be allowed to leave with their lives, personal possessions, and honor intact. They might march out of the castle with their weapons and banners, demonstrating that they had not been defeated but had simply chosen to yield. This type of honorable surrender was more common early in a siege, before the attackers had invested too much time and resources in the operation. But if the siege had dragged on for months and the attackers had suffered significant casualties, the terms of surrender would be much harsher. The defenders might be required to surrender unconditionally, placing themselves entirely at the mercy of the victorious commander. Some might be executed as examples, particularly the leaders who had organized the resistance. Others might be imprisoned, enslaved, or held for ransom. The castle itself might be destroyed to prevent it from being used again. The decision of when to surrender was agonizing for the castle's lord. Surrender too early, and he would be seen as a coward who had betrayed his duty. Surrender too late, and he would condemn everyone in the castle to unnecessary suffering and possibly death. There was no clear right answer, and lords who made the wrong decision would be criticized regardless of what they chose. The physical condition of siege survivors was often terrible. Months of malnutrition would have left them emaciated and weak, with sunken eyes, protruding bones, and skin that hung loosely on their frames. Many would have diseases, scurvy, dysentery, typhus, or other infections that had spread through the crowded, unsanitary castle. Some would have wounds from combat or accidents that had become infected and were slowly killing them. The process of recovery from severe malnutrition was dangerous and had to be managed carefully. People who had been starving couldn't simply start eating normally again. Their digestive systems had shut down, and eating too much too quickly could cause refeeding syndrome, a potentially fatal condition. Survivors needed to be given small amounts of easily digestible food and gradually increased their intake over days or weeks. Many siege survivors died during this recovery period, killed by the very food they had been craving. The psychological condition of survivors was equally damaged. They would be suffering from what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, with symptoms including nightmares, flashbacks, hypervigilance, emotional numbness, and difficulty trusting others. They would have survivors' guilt, wondering why they lived when so many others died. They would be haunted by memories of the things they had seen and done during the siege. The social reintegration of siege survivors was difficult and often incomplete. They had been through experiences that most people couldn't understand or relate to. They had made moral compromises and done things that they were ashamed of. They had witnessed horrors that they couldn't talk about. This created a barrier between survivors and the rest of society, leaving them isolated and unable to fully reconnect with normal life. The economic impact of sieges on survivors was severe. The castle and surrounding lands would have been devastated by the siege. Crops would have been destroyed, livestock killed or driven off, buildings burned, and infrastructure damaged. It would take years to rebuild and recover economically. Many survivors would be left destitute, having lost everything they owned during the siege. The families of those who died during the siege faced particular hardships. Widows and orphans would have lost their primary breadwinners and would struggle to survive. In medieval society, women and children without male protectors were extremely vulnerable to poverty, exploitation, and abuse. Some widows would remarry quickly out of economic necessity rather than choice. Others would be forced to rely on charity or enter religious institutions. The political consequences of sieges could be far-reaching. A successful siege could shift the balance of power in a region, with the victorious lord gaining territory, resources, and prestige. A failed siege could weaken an attacker and embolden his enemies. The outcome of a single siege could determine the course of larger conflicts and affect the lives of thousands of people who were never directly involved. The legal aftermath of sieges was complex and often contentious. Questions about property rights, inheritance, debts, and obligations would need to be resolved. If the castle had changed hands, the new lord would need to establish his authority and deal with the remnants of the previous administration. If the castle had been destroyed, disputes about who owned the land and who was responsible for rebuilding would arise. The religious response to sieges was also significant. Survivors would often make pilgrimages to holy sites to give thanks for their survival or to seek forgiveness for things they had done during the siege. Churches and monasteries would hold special services to pray for the souls of those who had died. Religious authorities would try to provide spiritual comfort to survivors and help them make sense of their suffering. The historical memory of sieges was shaped by those who survived to tell the story. Chronicles and records would be written, often emphasizing the heroism of the defenders or the cruelty of the attackers, depending on who was doing the writing. These accounts would become part of the historical narrative, influencing how future generations understood the events. But the voices of ordinary people, the servants, the children, the women, were rarely recorded, and their experiences were lost to history. The physical scars of sieges remained visible in the landscape for centuries. Ruined castles, damaged walls, and abandoned settlements served as reminders of the violence and destruction that had occurred. Some castles were rebuilt and continued to be used, while others were left as ruins, slowly crumbling back into the earth. These ruins became part of the cultural landscape, inspiring stories, legends, and eventually romantic notions about medieval warfare that bore little resemblance to the brutal reality. The lessons learned from sieges influenced military strategy and castle design for generations. Engineers would study what had worked and what had failed, developing new defensive features and new siege techniques. Castles built after major sieges would incorporate improvements designed to address the vulnerabilities that had been exposed. This ongoing arms race between attackers and defenders drove innovation in military technology and architecture. The cultural impact of sieges extended beyond military matters. Stories of famous sieges became part of the collective memory, told and retold in songs, poems, and chronicles. These stories often emphasize themes of courage, loyalty, betrayal, and sacrifice, providing moral lessons and entertainment for audiences. But the romanticized versions of these stories bore little resemblance to the actual experiences of those who lived through sieges. The long-term health effects on siege survivors were severe and often shortened their lifespans. The malnutrition, disease, and stress they had endured would have permanent effects on their bodies. They would be more susceptible to illness, would age prematurely, and would often die younger than they otherwise would have. The children who survived sieges would often have stunted growth and developmental problems that affected them for the rest of their lives. The intergenerational trauma caused by sieges affected families for generations. Parents who had survived sieges would pass on their fears, anxieties, and coping mechanisms to their children. They might be overprotective, constantly worried about security and survival. They might have difficulty forming close emotional bonds, having learned during the siege that attachment led to pain when people died. These patterns of behavior would affect their children and grandchildren, creating a legacy of trauma that extended far beyond the original event. The question of whether siege warfare was worth the cost is one that medieval people themselves sometimes asked. The enormous suffering, the destruction of resources, the loss of life, all of this for what? To capture a single castle? To assert dominance over a rival? To settle a dispute that might have been resolved through negotiation? Some medieval writers and thinkers questioned the morality and rationality of siege warfare, but their voices were drowned out by the prevailing culture of violence and the political realities that made warfare seem necessary. The cultural impact of sieges extended beyond military matters. Stories of famous sieges became part of the collective memory, told and retold in songs, poems, and chronicles. These stories often emphasized themes of courage, loyalty, betrayal, and sacrifice, providing moral lessons and entertainment for audiences. But the romanticized versions of these stories bore little resemblance to the actual experiences of those who lived through sieges. The long-term health effects on siege survivors were severe and often shortened their lifespans. The malnutrition, disease, and stress they had endured would have permanent effects on their bodies. They would be more susceptible to illness, would age prematurely, and would often die younger than they otherwise would have. The children who survived sieges would often have stunted growth and developmental problems that affected them for the rest of their lives. The intergenerational trauma caused by sieges affected families for generations. Parents who had survived sieges would pass on their fears, anxieties, and coping mechanisms to their children. They might be overprotective, constantly worried about security and survival. They might have difficulty forming close emotional bonds, having learned during the siege that attachment led to pain when people died. These patterns of behavior would affect their children and grandchildren, creating a legacy of trauma that extended far beyond the original event. The question of whether siege warfare was worth the cost is one that medieval people themselves sometimes asked. The enormous suffering, the destruction of resources, the loss of life, all of this for what? To capture a single castle? To assert dominance over a rival? To settle a dispute that might have been resolved through negotiation? Some medieval writers and thinkers questioned the morality and rationality of siege warfare, but their voices were drowned out by the prevailing culture of violence and the political realities that made warfare seem necessary. The cultural impact of sieges extended beyond military matters. Stories of famous sieges became part of the collective memory, told and retold in songs, poems, and chronicles. These stories often emphasized themes of courage, loyalty, betrayal, and sacrifice, providing moral lessons and entertainment for audiences. But the romanticized versions of these stories bore little resemblance to the actual experiences of those who lived through sieges. The long-term health effects on siege survivors were severe and often shortened their lifespans. The malnutrition, disease, and stress they had endured would have permanent effects on their bodies. They would be more susceptible to illness, would age prematurely, and would often die younger than they otherwise would have. The children who survived sieges would often have stunted growth and developmental problems that affected them for the rest of their lives. The intergenerational trauma caused by sieges affected families for generations. Parents who had survived sieges would pass on their fears, anxieties, and coping mechanisms to their children. They might be overprotective, constantly worried about security and survival. They might have difficulty forming close emotional bonds, having learned during the siege that attachment led to pain when people died. These patterns of behavior would affect their children and grandchildren, creating a legacy of trauma that extended far beyond the original event. The question of whether siege warfare was worth the cost is one that medieval people themselves sometimes asked. The enormous suffering, the destruction of resources, the loss of life, all of this for what? To capture a single castle? to assert dominance over a rival, to settle a dispute that might have been resolved through negotiation. Some medieval writers and thinkers questioned the morality and rationality of siege warfare, but their voices were drowned out by the prevailing culture of violence and the political realities that made warfare seem necessary. The comparison between medieval sieges and modern warfare reveals both similarities and differences. Modern sieges, such as those that occurred during World War II or more recent conflicts, share many characteristics with medieval sieges: the encirclement, the bombardment, the starvation, the psychological warfare. But modern sieges are often even more destructive due to advanced weapons technology. The fundamental human experience of being trapped, terrified, and slowly dying, however, remains the same across the centuries. If you had survived a medieval castle siege, the end of the siege would not have been the end of your ordeal. You would have faced months or years of physical recovery, psychological healing, and social reintegration. You would have carried the scars, both visible and invisible, for the rest of your life. You would have been changed by the experience in ways that you couldn't fully articulate or understand. And you would have known, with absolute certainty, that you had survived something that most people couldn't have endured. The bitter end of a medieval castle siege was not a moment of triumph or relief, but rather the beginning of a long, difficult process of trying to rebuild lives that had been shattered by violence, suffering, and loss. The survivors would carry the weight of their experiences forever, a burden that would shape who they were and how they lived for the rest of their days. As we reach the end of our journey through the horrors of medieval castle sieges, the inescapable truth becomes clear: you wouldn't have survived. Not because you lack courage, intelligence, or determination, but because medieval castle sieges were designed to break human beings in every possible way: physically, psychologically, socially, and spiritually. The combination of starvation, disease, violence, and psychological torture created conditions that were simply beyond what most people could endure. The statistics of siege survival were grim. Historical records suggest that mortality rates during long sieges could reach 50% or higher among the defenders. And these figures don't account for those who died shortly after the siege ended from disease, malnutrition, or injuries sustained during the final assault. When you factor in the long-term health effects and shortened lifespans of survivors, the true death toll of sieges was even higher. But the numbers only tell part of the story. The quality of life for those who did survive was often so diminished that death might have seemed preferable. The physical disabilities, the chronic health problems, the psychological trauma, and the social stigma that siege survivors faced meant that their lives after the siege were often filled with suffering and hardship. The social structure of medieval society made survival even more difficult for most people. If you were a common soldier, a servant, or a peasant who had taken refuge in the castle, your life was considered expendable. You would receive smaller food rations than the nobles and knights. You would be assigned the most dangerous duties. You would have no say in decisions about surrender or resistance. Your survival would depend entirely on the decisions of people who had little concern for your welfare. If you were a woman, your situation would be even worse. You would face all the same dangers as men: starvation, disease, bombardment, plus the additional threat of sexual violence. If the castle fell, you would have no political power and no ability to influence the course of events. Your fate would be entirely in the hands of men who might or might not choose to protect you. If you were a child, your chances of survival would be the lowest of all. Children were the most vulnerable to malnutrition and disease. They couldn't contribute much to the defense, so they were often seen as burdens who consumed precious resources. Many children died during sieges, and those who survived were often permanently damaged physically and psychologically. The elderly faced their own set of challenges. Their bodies were less able to cope with the hardships of siege life, and they would often die relatively early in a siege. Some elderly people would voluntarily reduce their own rations to give more food to younger family members, essentially choosing to starve to death so that others might live. The moral compromises that you would be forced to make during a siege would haunt you for the rest of your life. You might have to steal food from others to feed your family. You might have to abandon sick friends to avoid infection. You might have to do things that violated your deepest values and beliefs. These moral injuries would be as painful as physical wounds and would be much harder to heal. The randomness of death during sieges was particularly disturbing. You could do everything right, follow orders, stay alert, take precautions, and still be killed by a random stone from a trebuchet or struck down by disease. Conversely, someone who was careless or cowardly might survive through sheer luck. This randomness made it difficult to maintain any sense of control or agency, contributing to feelings of helplessness and despair. The duration of sieges was a crucial factor in survival. A siege that lasted a few weeks might be endurable, with most people surviving if they had adequate supplies, but a siege that lasted months or years would inevitably result in mass casualties from starvation and disease. The longest recorded medieval sieges lasted for years, and by the time they ended, the majority of the original defenders were dead. The season when a siege began also affected survival chances. A siege that began in autumn after the harvest would find the castle with full storerooms and a better chance of holding out through the winter. A siege that began in spring, before the harvest, would mean that food supplies were at their lowest and would run out more quickly. Winter sieges were particularly brutal because of the cold, while summer sieges saw higher rates of disease due to heat and poor sanitation. The size of the castle and the number of people inside it were critical factors. A large castle with a small garrison might have enough food to last for months, but if the castle was crowded with refugees from the surrounding countryside, the food would run out much more quickly. The decision of whether to admit refugees was a difficult one. Turning them away was cruel, but admitting them might doom everyone inside the castle. The quality of the castle's defenses made a significant difference in survival chances. A castle with thick walls, multiple defensive layers, and a reliable water source could hold out much longer than a castle with weak fortifications. But even the strongest castle could eventually be taken if the attackers were determined enough and willing to pay the price in time and lives. The competence and character of the castle's lord were crucial to survival. A skilled military commander who made good tactical decisions, maintained discipline, and kept morale high could significantly improve everyone's chances of survival, but an incompetent or cowardly lord could doom the castle through poor decisions or by surrendering prematurely. And a cruel or selfish lord might hoard food for himself and his favorites while letting others starve. The determination and resources of the attacking army were equally important. An attacker who was willing to maintain a siege for years and who had the resources to do so would eventually prevail against almost any defense. But an attacker who was under time pressure or who lacked adequate supplies might give up and withdraw, allowing the defenders to survive. The possibility of relief by a friendly army was often the defenders' greatest hope. If they could hold out long enough for reinforcements to arrive, they might be saved. But relief armies often failed to materialize, either because they were defeated in battle, because political circumstances changed, or because the lord who was supposed to send help decided it wasn't worth the cost. Waiting for relief that never came was one of the cruelest aspects of siege warfare. The psychological resilience of individuals varied greatly, and this affected their survival chances. Some people were able to maintain hope and determination even in the most desperate circumstances. Others would give up relatively quickly, becoming passive and non-functional. The ability to adapt to changing circumstances, to find meaning in suffering, and to maintain social connections were all factors that influenced survival. The role of luck cannot be overstated. You might be the strongest, smartest, most prepared person in the castle and still be killed by a random projectile on the first day of the siege. Or you might be weak and unprepared, but survive through a series of fortunate accidents. This element of chance made siege survival feel arbitrary and unfair, adding to the psychological burden. The historical legacy of medieval castle sieges influenced military strategy and architecture for centuries. The lessons learned from these brutal conflicts shaped the development of fortifications, siege weapons, and military tactics. But the human cost of these lessons was enormous. Millions of people suffered and died in sieges throughout the medieval period, their lives sacrificed to the ambitions and conflicts of their rulers. The romanticization of medieval warfare in modern culture obscures the brutal reality of sieges. Movies, television shows, and video games often portray castle sieges as exciting adventures with clear heroes and villains, dramatic battles, and happy endings. But the real experience of a medieval siege was nothing like this. It was a slow, grinding nightmare of hunger, disease, fear, and violence that destroyed lives and communities. Understanding the reality of medieval castle sieges helps us appreciate the progress that has been made in reducing human suffering during conflicts. Modern international humanitarian law, while imperfectly enforced, at least recognizes that civilians should be protected during warfare and that certain tactics, like deliberately starving civilian populations, are war crimes. Medieval warfare had no such constraints, and the suffering was correspondingly greater. The study of medieval sieges also reminds us that human nature hasn't changed fundamentally over the centuries. The same capacity for cruelty, the same willingness to inflict suffering on others to achieve political goals, and the same ability to rationalize atrocities still exist today. The weapons and tactics have changed, but the underlying dynamics of siege warfare, the attempt to break an enemy's will through prolonged suffering, remain relevant in modern conflicts. If you had been transported back in time to a medieval castle under siege, your modern knowledge and perspective would have provided little advantage. You might understand germ theory and know that boiling water makes it safer to drink, but you wouldn't be able to create antibiotics or modern medical treatments. You might know that malnutrition weakens the immune system, but you wouldn't be able to conjure food out of thin air. You might understand the psychological effects of trauma, but you wouldn't have access to modern therapeutic techniques. In fact, your modern sensibilities might actually make survival more difficult. You would be horrified by the casual violence, the acceptance of suffering, and the moral compromises that medieval people took for granted. You would struggle with the lack of privacy, the unsanitary conditions, and the constant proximity to death and disease. Your expectations of comfort, safety, and individual rights would be constantly violated, adding to your psychological distress. The ultimate lesson of medieval castle sieges is that human beings are both incredibly resilient and terribly fragile. People endured conditions that seem unimaginable to us today, surviving through a combination of physical toughness, psychological adaptation, social support, and sheer luck. But many others, probably the majority, didn't survive, and even those who did were permanently scarred by their experiences. The castle siege was one of the defining experiences of medieval warfare, and it reveals the dark side of a period that is often romanticized in popular culture. Behind the beautiful castles and tales of chivalry was a reality of brutal violence, systematic cruelty, and immense human suffering. Understanding this reality doesn't diminish the architectural and cultural achievements of the medieval period, but it does provide important context and reminds us of the human cost of those achievements. As we conclude our journey through the horrors of medieval castle sieges, we can be grateful that we live in a time when such experiences are rare rather than common. We can appreciate the relative peace and security that most of us enjoy, while also recognizing that many people in the world today still face conditions that are not so different from those of a medieval siege, trapped in conflict zones, subjected to bombardment, cut off from food and medical supplies, and living in constant fear for their lives. The story of medieval castle sieges is ultimately a story about human suffering and human endurance. It's a reminder that our ancestors faced challenges that we can barely imagine, and that the comfortable lives we lead today are built on the sacrifices of countless people who came before us. It's also a warning about the consequences of warfare and the importance of working to prevent conflicts that cause such immense suffering. You wouldn't have survived a medieval castle siege. Very few people did. But by understanding what those who lived through these ordeals experienced, we can better appreciate the value of peace, the importance of protecting civilians during conflicts, and the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable adversity. The fire burns low, the shadows lengthen, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolls the hour. The medieval castle stands silent against the darkening sky, its stones bearing witness to centuries of suffering and survival. The siege is over, but its lessons remain, carved not in stone, but in the human heart. reminding us of the terrible cost of war and the precious value of peace.